Revealed in upcoming episodes of this program are the contents of a recently unearthed repository classified by the secret government, the Phenomenon Archives.
Energy. Without it, the world economy would grind to a catastrophic halt. In the 20th century, wars have been waged over fossil fuels. What if we were to learn that there exists a new form of clean energy in virtually unlimited supply? A renewable resource, legitimized in hundreds of laboratory tests and peer-reviewed scientific journals, but which is ignored by governments and censored by many prestigious publications.
Water. Its urgent rush to shore has chiseled craggy cliffs from solid stone. It is home to the great animals of the sea and is the stuff of which 60% of the human body is composed. Over 2/3 of our world's surface is covered with this life-sustaining substance. Yet to this day, many aspects of water remain a mystery. Over a century ago, visionary novelist Jules Verne wrote, "I believe that water will one day be employed as a fuel, that hydrogen and oxygen which constitute it, used singly or together, will furnish an inexhaustible source of heat and light." On March 23, 1989, Jules Verne's prophecy of a world powered by water rose upon the landscape of popular culture. Two distinguished chemists, Dr. Martin Fleischmann and Dr. Stanley Pons, announced to the amazement of the world that they had detected a nuclear-like reaction that could turn water into a powerful new fuel. Their discovery became known as cold fusion because, they said, it delivered fusion energy like that produced in the sun without emitting deadly radiation.
We didn't call it cold fusion at all. That was a term which was wished on us, but we never called it that. We felt the processes had to be nuclear to account for the high levels of the energy.
In answer to their claim, the Department of Energy quickly assembled a review panel headed up by Dr. John Huizenga.
We wrote a very negative report and concluded that the results that were being presented to us were contrary to everything we had found out about nuclear physics over the last 50 years.
The sword of this panel's condemnation struck with speed and brutality, ignoring the facts in a blind rush to judgment.
Hot fusion physics people have been very vigorous in their denunciation of this being called fusion.
Right away, reports came in of excess heat, much too large to be from any chemical reaction. Laboratories from Texas to India confirmed the presence of tritium, a vital determining feature of a nuclear reaction.
Within 2 or 3 weeks, we got the first results, and several groups started saying, yes, we are seeing excess heat, and but the most important and unbelievable phenomenon at that time was the observation of tritium.
A mudslinging frenzy followed. The old guard of the scientific establishment, with their powerful influence in media and government, did everything possible to denounce Pons, Fleischmann, and their unprecedented work.
In conclusion, we have no evidence in our laboratory with any of our samples for fusion.
I'm very sorry that Professor Lewis has no information on the tritium levels. That is available, and is available
in the correction list to the paper?
We know the foreground, we don't know the background. I would like to specifically...
The background, I beg your pardon, the background is available in the corrections to the paper.
That might be. I would like to specifically hear whether or not helium...
Don't
Could we go on to the question?
Peer-reviewed publications like Nature divisively shamed the discoverers with allegations of incompetence, touching off one of the greatest tragedies in the history of science.
I think that, broadly speaking, it's dead, and it'll remain dead for a long, long time.
This was a discovery perhaps as significant as the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk. But instead of embracing it, the governors of official science declared war on cold fusion. Was the promise of cold fusion too good to be true? Or was it trampled on by closed-minded, greedy power brokers whose special interests outweighed the public good?
Hydrogen and oxygen, the components of water, are two of the most reactive elements on Earth. Electrolysis, the process of extracting them from water as gas, has been known to science for nearly 200 years. This knowledge has enabled us to develop fuels, some of which are used to propel manned rockets into space. Though powerful, these chemical fuels don't hold a candle to the energy release of a nuclear reaction. The fire of this miracle was at the heart of what Pons and Fleischmann offered to the world with their groundbreaking cold fusion process.
When positively charged deuterons are attracted to the palladium cathode, they cram together, and there are millions and millions of them inside the cathode, getting closer and closer, and then they fuse, and they create energy in the form of helium. There's more energy in 1 cubic mile of seawater than in all the known oil reserves on Earth. I mean, you could drive your car 55 million miles on a gallon of heavy water. Maybe the end of pollution.
Hollywood's starry-eyed version of energy from water seems the stuff of fantasy. And while it is true that a definitive theory describing the effect has eluded scientists, former chief science writer for MIT, engineer Dr. Eugene Maloff, has assembled the evidence that takes the illusion out of cold fusion.
When I finished my book Fire from Ice in 1991, I concluded that the evidence for cold fusion was overwhelmingly compelling. Today, we can no longer say that the evidence is overwhelmingly compelling. It is now 100% certain.
Dismissed early on by carpers and critics, the field of cold fusion is very much alive. Energy-producing devices exist today that seem to defy the conventions of modern science.
We're getting nuclear energy output without the nuclear radiation byproducts.
If an atom were a huge athletic stadium, at its center would be a nucleus the size of a pea. In turn, an atom in the eye of this mouse would compare in size to the mouse, in the same way the mouse compares in size to the entire Earth. This comparison is characteristic of the monumental challenge faced by scientists worldwide in their effort to unravel the riddle of the cold fusion effect.
Our critics would say that the problem with cold fusion is that there is no theory to describe it. The problem is completely different. The problem is that there are far too many theories which purport to describe the same set of observations, and no more than one of these theories can be correct.
Fusion takes place when the nuclei of two atoms, usually hydrogen, collide and fuse together, releasing vast amounts of energy. Prevailing theory suggests that this can only happen at extreme temperatures like those found on the Sun or in a nuclear blast. Experimental reactor facilities like the Jet Plasma Hot Fusion site in England have attempted to replicate the fusion process of the Sun for decades.
Because current technology demands that more energy has to be put into a reaction than comes out, it hasn't been economically viable. However, Stanley Pons of the University of Utah and Martin Fleischmann of the University of Southampton claimed that they could create a fusion reaction at room temperature and make fusion energy a reality with the potential of making uncounted billions of energy dollars.
Scientists at hot fusion facilities like Princeton and MIT, seeking to replicate solar fusion, have received untold billions for the building of magnetically ringed tokamak reactors. Although a great deal has been learned through experimentation in this field, the process itself has never produced a single watt of excess power. At the time of the Pons and Fleischmann announcement, hot fusion research was in full swing. Several powerful university budgets were reliant upon research dollars siphoned off government coffers into the development of this technology.
Partly it was a very unfortunate time to make such an announcement for various political reasons, really. The situation in the United States, the situation with regard to the program in hot fusion. That was against it, but also, of course, was the fact that we were not ready to make such an announcement.
Cold fusion violates most of what I was taught in nuclear chemistry. Once you see it happen in front of you and in your own apparatus, it's pretty convincing that there's a reality, and that's what I base my continued interest on.
Since Pons and Fleischmann were both well aware of the pitfalls of premature publicity, why would they bypass the accepted conventions of the peer review system and announce their discovery through the media?
I was thinking, these guys are no fools. They know what they're doing. These are good scientists.
Prior to the 1989 announcement, Stephen E. Jones, a physics professor at nearby Brigham Young University, learned of Pons and Fleischmann's work through an informant at the DOE. In a flagrant example of shameless opportunism, Jones insisted on going public quickly with his comparatively much less clear results. Disparaging the excess heat claims of Fleischmann and Pons, Jones' announcement would have effectively prevented the two scientists from patenting their process, a process they had developed on their own over long years of research. On the advice of university attorneys, Pons and Fleischmann, feeling their backs to the wall, reluctantly delivered their work to public scrutiny. Though their discovery posed a very clear challenge to the energy industry, it was the scientific community, mostly physicists, which raised the specter of doubt and wrongdoing.
This experiment hasn't been reproduced by any national laboratory or any university yet without a good football team.
Cold fusion researcher Dr. Robert Bush.
Our reaction was not unlike that of other physicists who thought, on the one hand, gee, that'd be marvelous if they're doing it, and then on the other hand, my God, chemists doing it for probably pennies compared to what physicists have taken from the public coffer over the last 40 years, in the order of $40 billion to do hot fusion.
It was war from the outset. On April 14, 1989, Dr. Glenn Seaborg, a Nobel laureate with a distinguished record in conventional nuclear science, told then-President Bush, it is not due to nuclear fusion. Secretary of Energy Admiral James Watkins nevertheless enlisted many federally funded laboratories to investigate the cold fusion claim.
Admiral Watkins, who was at that time head of the Department of Energy, he had an edict. He said, this must be verified in 2 weeks. I'm going to put the whole of the DOE labs on it. So I had put the whole of my team on it. And of course it turned out that you couldn't get any results under 4 weeks, so he demanded the impossible, you see.
Massachusetts Institute of Technology was one of the testing facilities selected by the Department of Energy. MIT's hot fusion director, Professor Ronald R. Parker, fired the next salvo. On the front page of the Boston Herald, Parker accused Fleischmann and Pons of possible fraud and of engaging in scientific schlock. It was a well-timed directive to the American Physical Society to go on the attack against cold fusion. Princeton's Professor William Happer, a hot fusion veteran and advisor to Secretary Watkins, was quoted as saying, just by looking at Fleischmann and Pons on television, you could tell they were incompetent boobs.
Credibility for a scientist is the coin of the realm, and if you lose that coin, then you can't get grant funding. Your work becomes regarded as inferior, and you slip down notches in the eyes of your peers, and this is a real disaster.
For 5 years prior to their announcement, Fleischmann and Pons had used their own money to conduct experiments, passing a current through an electrochemical cell containing deuterium oxide, heavy water. One of the electrodes in the cell was made of the precious metal palladium. The electrical current separated out individual deuterium atoms and forced them to pack tightly into the palladium cathode. What happened next remains a mystery. Whether it was nuclear fusion or something else, the heat energy that came out of that little jar was thousands to millions of times what could be explained by any known chemical reaction.
To most classically trained physicists, the idea that low-level nuclear reactions could produce significant heat energy was unthinkable. The nuclei of atoms are all positively charged. They repel each other. They don't want to come together or fuse except at millions of degrees. And when they do, deadly radiation can be the result.
The U.S. Department of Energy, or DOE, convened a review panel in April of 1989. Dr. John Huizinga, an early cold fusion critic, was assigned to a chair position, though his bias against cold fusion was well known. Huizinga claimed cold fusion was nonsense and advised authorities against a formal investigation. By mid-July, the DOE panel had completed their damning report.
Earlier in this century, a very distinguished chemist by the name of Irving Langmuir defined pathological science as the science of things that aren't true. And I have labeled my book, Cold Fusion, the scientific fiasco of the century, simply because there's no experimental evidence at this point that any nuclear reaction products have been formed. Therefore, the claim that cold fusion is a nuclear reaction process without a commensurate amount of nuclear reaction products is simply pathological science.
But 10 years of results from successful experiments support another conclusion.
There are thousands of papers that have already been published on cold fusion showing the evidence for the excess heat in nuclear products, including helium, tritium, low-level neutrons. But at the same time, we have the establishment of physics and the establishment of science, for that matter, totally ignoring this and, in fact, mocking it.
Very quickly, I realized that cold fusion was going to be the world's best example of pathological science.
The criticism of pathological science is one which has quite frequently been leveled at unusual investigations, which admittedly sometimes are at fault. However, there is also the situation that people will criticize a field long after they should really have given up. And that is pathological criticism. They just get trapped in a situation. They have made a criticism. They have to maintain that criticism against all the evidence.
After decades of painstaking observation through his own homemade ground glass lenses, the Dutch janitor Anthony Leeuwenhoek opened our eyes to the realm of microbiology in the year 1675. The world of science, however, continued to thumb its nose at the field for nearly 200 years, ridiculing the work of men like the great Louis Pasteur. Inventor Thomas Edison's vision of a world powered by direct current had its roots in his own pocketbook. His public criticisms of the work of rival Nikola Tesla almost cost civilization the miracle of AC current.
When the Wright brothers first flew in 1903, no papers covered it at all, because everybody was convinced, certainly the American press, that heavier-than-air flight was totally impossible. All the top scientists said this is nonsense. And editors wouldn't even bother to send journalists or photographers to interview the Wrights, or even to take pictures of them flying in full public view. And it wasn't for about 5 years that eventually they realized, my goodness, this is real. Heavier-than-air flight is possible. And I think a similar thing is going to happen with so-called cold fusion.
The scientific groundwork for cold fusion has been accomplished with great difficulty by underfunded scientists toiling over experiments in laboratories and basements around the world. Whether their efforts remain eclipsed by hot fusion and other cash cow programs or win the support of science and the public will be revealed over time.
Despite the nasty accusations made against cold fusion, accomplished scientists like Dr. Bob Bush and Dr. Edmund Storms of the Los Alamos Laboratory continued their leading-edge work, often producing extraordinary results.
We were seeing this marvelous effect of excess power and integrate over time excess heat in our own laboratory. So it wasn't as if we had to take somebody else's word for it. We had proved it. The conclusion was that the amount of palladium that you could fit on your thumb would be enough to produce a reactor that would supply the city of Los Angeles with all their power needs.
Supporting evidence mounted throughout the 90s, yet revered experts like Huizinga, Happer, and Morrison clung to their original conclusions, flying the one prevailing negative DOE report as their standard.
There is something new coming up. You know, professors who teach physics hate to change their courses.
Plugging the bypass should have an impact.
And generally, they don't appreciate monsters which crop up and which cannot be explained within the frame of the present knowledge.
Sociologists of science have said that if you get 4 big names in a field of science to stand up and say that something isn't so, that unfortunately all of the other people tend to fall into line kind of herd-like.
When science becomes a part of the belief structure of society, you have the danger that people aren't going to go beyond the boundaries of that science. And every year we are discovering things that we didn't know last year. So science must always keep pace with discovery. And discovery is a real-time process. It is not about dogma.
Professor George Miley, director of the Fusion Studies Laboratory at the University of Illinois, was one of the few editors of a peer-reviewed journal to accept papers on cold fusion.
Let's take tritium as an example, which is work that Tom Claytor has done at Los Alamos. I asked him, have you convinced your management at Los Alamos that tritium is real? And he said, no, I haven't. Problem is that I only get a positive results 3 times out of 10. Now think about that. If it happens once, the inquisitive scientists should say, well, how did it happen? Let's find out how we can ultimately make it happen consistently.
At SRI International, Dr. Michael McCuber was one of the first scientists to replicate the cold fusion effect.
There is clearly evidence of anomalous excess heat which occur in these experiments. There are also, in similar experiments, evidence of an anomalous nuclear process. It's my suspicion, my bias, if you like, that the 2 anomalies are in fact connected.
In the free-for-all that followed the cold fusion announcement, hot fusion proponents drew the specious conclusion that cold fusion must work like hot fusion. If Pons and Fleischmann are alive, they contended, then their results must be faulty, since the neutron radiation from the fusion reaction would surely have killed them. They refused to consider that another form of the same process might be at work. In the years that have followed, the cold fusion process has repeatedly produced not only heat energy, but also nuclear byproducts such as tritium and the ash from a nuclear reaction, that all-important indicator of nuclear fusion, helium.
It's clearly not possible to produce helium from a chemical process. The only possibility that remains is that the helium is produced by a nuclear process. If the helium is produced by a nuclear process, then necessarily there will be an associated release of heat.
Basically, we were just trying to find out when we had excess heat, would there be helium present in the sample? And when there was no excess heat, we would find no helium present.
8 times when we had excess heat, we found helium. We ran controls 6 times when there was no excess heat, there was no helium.
Were the alleged negative findings of MIT and Caltech what soured science and the public to the cold fusion claim? Pons and Fleischmann had, after all, breached scientific etiquette by going public first, instead of through the accepted channels of the peer-reviewed system.
Data should be published in the most reputable of scientific journals. It should not be published first in the newspapers. It should not be disseminated through the popular media until in fact the information can be replicated.
Officials at the University of Utah were chastised for their haste in publicizing the discovery through the media.
There's a hypothesis, an idea. The idea is tested in the laboratory. It's written up in a journal. It undergoes peer review, which means experts in the field look at that information. They test its validity. They ask questions about its validity. Then it's published in the journal. Then, of course, the scientific community reads it. Then the scientific community tries to test can they repeat this experiment?
Indeed, data affirming vital aspects of the discovery was published in reputable journals. But the presiding agenda of official science, the science of money and politics, drowned the truth in accusations of impropriety and outright fraud.
When it was first said by Fleischmann and Pons that cold fusion existed, this went all the way up to the president, and the president appointed a special committee of 22 excellent scientists to investigate it. And these scientists announced that they were going to U-turn to other laboratories to try and see what was happening. But every time they went to this laboratory, by some miracle, none of the cells worked at this time.
When the ERAB panel came through with Huizenga as the chairman on July the 6th, 1989, to visit, they were looking very lightly at the heat measurements and very strongly at the absence of neutrons and tritium. Once they saw no neutrons and tritium, they could use that to denounce the field and protect their budgets. And fascinatingly, many of the people on that panel, a couple of them I should say, came to me looking for research funds in this field, even though publicly they were speaking before Congress against having Congress put any money in it.
Early on, they were able to show that Pons and Fleischmann essentially made some serious mistakes in their interpretation of the nuclear physics. Eventually, I think because of this bad nuclear physics, the physicists threw out the good baby, which was the excess heat effect, along with the bad nuclear interpretation bathwater.
Also working in the field of cold fusion were esteemed scientists with personal knowledge of and confidence in the work of Pons and Fleischmann. Scientists whose careers were likewise untarnished. Texas A&M professor John Bachris, regarded as a world-class electrochemist, led a research group at Texas A&M that produced essential evidence of the fusion phenomenon.
The first thing was this thing called tritium, which is a sub-form of hydrogen which should not exist except in extremely tiny quantities. And we found that by working these cells of Fleischmann and Pons that we could produce this tritium in great abundance. It was the first clear proof of the phenomenon.
Fortuitous or not, in the first experiment that we ran some 3 or 4 months after the initial announcement, we saw some evidence of excess heat.
And what we see in our laboratory is no evidence for any unusual nuclear or chemical reactions.
Having seen the effect with my own eyes, the claims from a few that this is impossible, inconsistent with all known laws of nuclear physics, these suggestions are in fact irrelevant.
At Texas A&M, the Bachris group came under attack. Science journalist Gary Taubes wrote an inflammatory article in Science magazine alleging that someone in the group had spiked the experiment with tritium. Although proven false, the accusation was enough to smear the work of the group and place Dr. Bachris in the line of fire.
Well, I was 69 years old at that time, and I took the attitude, suppose they fire me, right? It doesn't really matter. I'd had my career. The worst they could do would be to say, go. But finally the university revolted against this. They set up an inquiry.
Normally we'd say someone's innocent until proven guilty, and you'd be given the opportunity to have a trial rather than having an article written about what you've done wrong and identifies being guilty in the press rather than due process.
Finally they came out okay. I mean, they gave me another letter. I'd had the letter of complete exoneration, but I think the main part was that I had done work which was against the paradigm. You know, people said that they'd been to other universities and people had laughed at it and said, what the heck are you doing, trying to disprove the laws of nuclear physics? And of course, that's exactly what we were doing, and succeeding, you see.
With government labs like Los Alamos and universities around the world confirming the presence of excess heat in nuclear products, why the continued debate? Why do influential skeptics still insist that nothing unusual is going on? What would motivate such blatant distortion of the facts?
Today, scientists must live in a world run by finances, and not only to maintain the good life for themselves, but also to stock their labs. Getting more money has become more vital to scientists, or as vital to scientists as the research itself.
MIT's Hot Fusion Center, a federally funded facility, was among the loudest voices to disparage the work of Pons and Fleischmann. Ironically, upon re-examination of their results, disturbing inconsistencies appeared. MIT's raw data provided clear evidence of excess heat, but in MIT's official report, the graph was altered to reflect no excess heat. Engineer Dr. Eugene Maloff, chief science journalist at MIT, resigned in protest.
That's what I thought originally.
In the case of MIT, it was a disaster. These people, before even analyzing their calorimetry data, held a party for the death of cold fusion. And then they manipulated the data to make a positive result look negative. Their results don't prove cold fusion, but they certainly had a positive result.
It's complete nonsense, utterly ridiculous and without foundation. And any allegations along those lines, I believe, are made by people that don't understand how measurements are made.
An official investigation of the fraud was requested. MIT President Charles Vest, concurrently a member of the White House Advisory Panel for the funding of hot fusion, conducted an investigation that was a sham. MIT's Hot Fusion Lab, the very facility which concocted the damning evidence that helped kill government funding for cold fusion in the U.S., went on to receive massive federal funding for its own hot fusion research. To this day, MIT's false no is cited as evidence against federal funding and the issuance of U.S. patents in the field. But MIT did not act alone.
I had a man, he was an employee of one of the national labs, and he said that on the plane over to Santa Fe, he had shown his boss some positive results, verifying phenomenon. And his boss had told him that if he presented those results, he'd be fired.
The boss I was working with at one point said, you should do that kind of experiment, that kind of experiment. And I said, well, look, I said, I'm more interested by doing something in cold fusion. I said, cold fusion, I mean, don't do that, he said. I said, why should I not do that? He said, because it doesn't work. I said, yes, it works. I've done experiments. I know people who have done experiments. I know Pons and Fleischmann. And look, he said, if you decide to do it, you cannot work with me anymore because I don't want my name to be attached to your name.
With congressional funding dead, Fleischmann and Pons moved to France to carry on their research.
By 1992, we had video recordings of intense energy release. By the summer of 1994, we had demonstrated sustained energy release. If you say you wish to make this into a device by about the year 2000, if the resources had been available, we would have got to that particular point, probably before the year 2000. But this did not happen.
Cold fusion pioneers carried on despite continued attacks on their reputations and careers. By 1999, 8 international conferences had been held with several thousand technical papers published in peer-reviewed journals worldwide. In the U.S., the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, a private consortium including dozens of utility companies, spent over $10 million to investigate cold fusion claims. In its final report, EPRI concluded, quote, definite evidence of nuclear reactions were detected. But with the federal funding out of the picture, proponents of cold fusion had to look elsewhere to continue their revolutionary science.
In the mid-90s, the government of Japan funded a cold fusion program called New Hydrogen Energy. Though short-lived, it inspired many Japanese scientists to break new ground in this area. The governments of Italy and France funded research, and many private startups in the U.S., convinced of the commercial potential of the process, began securing related patents, while carefully avoiding the stigma of being tagged cold fusion. Over the last decade, independent inventors have developed cold fusion devices that have at first glance seemed promising, only to fall short when examined by qualified scientists. But what if a cold fusion device did exist that produced excess heat consistently before trained independent eyes? Clean Energy Technologies of Sarasota, Florida, has already brought scientific demonstration cells to market. Using ordinary water and tiny metal-coated beads, they claim their Patterson power cell has produced up to 1,000 times the input power. Motorola sponsored a test of this cell wherein 20 watts of heat were produced for 11 hours. This heat continued even after the tiny input electricity was turned off.
They start producing excess heat almost right away. By the time we do the measurements, there's already excess heat.
While carefully avoiding being called cold fusion, Dr. Randall Mills of Blacklight Power in New Jersey has attracted substantial funding, creating a company positioned to be a leading manufacturer in the new energy age.
Some of our better experiments with the electrolytic cell have generated as much as 1,000% excess heat. For example, if we put 1 watt into the cell, we will get 10 watts out.
This vessel is sitting here making, as we watch, helium-4, and the temperature is 215 degrees centigrade. This is the key. You change this just a little bit, and it doesn't work at all. Now, this is a very novel concept that you can have a nuclear fusion occur at 215 centigrade and 1 atmosphere pressure.
The temperature record quite clearly indicates in these experiments, as it does in Les Case's experiment, that there is an unexplained source of heat, and the magnitude of that source of heat is approximately the right value to account for the observed helium.
So inside this vessel now for 6-7 weeks, we have had deuterium fusing to helium-4 and giving this excess temperature of about 35 degrees centigrade, which is big, a really big effect.
The technology of catalytic fusion developed by Dr. Les Case is one of the most extraordinary developments we have in the cold fusion field. He has excess heat, massive excess heat, and also helium-4 production, the very nuclear ash that the opponents of cold fusion demanded in the early days. It appears as though he is very close to having a self-sustaining device that will keep hot by itself, generate steam, hot water, perhaps electricity, before much longer.
Alchemy, the idea that lead can be turned into gold, was always considered a medieval myth. While modern science has proved that transmutation of elements is possible, the process is far too costly to be practical. Yet as early as 1992, scientists experimenting with cold fusion observed in their spent cells small amounts of metals like copper, silver, and zinc that simply shouldn't be there.
Kevin Wolf, a nuclear physicist incidentally, made many measurements of tritium. Then he got some even more astonishing results as early as '92, which were these transmutational results, the metal forming another metal inside the electrode, you see, which was super anti-paradigm. You know, there's that dreadful word alchemy, which we mustn't use, but it was a form of that in a way, that was creating new metals, you see.
Tadayoshi Omori and Tadahiko Mizuno of the Hokkaido University in Japan produced volumes of data documenting the production of metals from iron to platinum. Along with these, consistently, came the production of excess heat energy. The potential environmental benefits of this technology are awesome. Companies like SETI, Trenergy, and the Cincinnati Group are developing ways to solve the world's radioactive waste problem, changing radioactive materials into some other form of harmless metal. In 1999, developments in this area prompted the DOE to award a research grant to Professor George Miley of the University of Illinois. However, within days of the grant announcement, the ever-vigilant critics of cold fusion science attacked Miley's work and killed his funding. On the secret panel set up to repeal the grant was the ardent enemy of cold fusion science himself, Dr. John Huizinga.
Nuclear energy was once a laboratory curiosity. So let's assume that these devices can be developed. The future is then almost unlimited. It could be the end of the fossil fuel age, the end of oil and coal, and the end, incidentally, of many of our worries about global pollution and global warming.
While the environmental challenges faced by the U.S. often make front-page news, the pollution problems encountered by third world nations and countries relying exclusively on fossil fuels fare much worse.
2/3 of the cities has problem in pollution. And 1/3 of the land of my country is damaged by the acid rain. The 80% of the power energy source is from coal. We have 1.2 billion population, and we anticipate it will be 1/2 or more billion in the middle of next century. We consume 1 ton of the coal per capita. So if we increase our power consumption by a factor of 3, then we will burn about 5 billion tons of coal in the middle of next century.
What is the ultimate potential of cold fusion technology? It has been estimated that 250 miles of coal cars could be replaced with as little as 1 pickup truck full of heavy water. The daily waste from a 1,000 megawatt cold fusion plant would be approximately 150 grams of helium, which is harmless compared to some 30,000 tons of carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and other wastes produced by a comparable fossil fuel plant.
What I like about cold fusion is it is different from thermal power, hydroelectric power, or nuclear fission power because it is potentially small and the investments required are much smaller, and hopefully it can be mass produced by industry. And this completely changes the whole concept of power generation, distribution, consumption.
I think the electric power grid will absolutely wither away. I think automobiles, trucks, trains, planes, all forms of transportation will use this new powerful energy source. The writing is on the wall. The fossil fuel age is about to end.
Every day, the burning of fossil fuels contributes to the destruction of our environment, while the breakthrough discovery of a totally clean, virtually unlimited energy source languishes in obscurity.
It's history in the making, what we're living here. I mean, I couldn't dream of a situation like that.
Despite a decade of experimentation and a body of indisputable evidence, the gatekeepers of official science continue to deprive us of a technology we so desperately need to be proper stewards of our world.
Without some morals or something to believe in on this planet, be it God or science or whatever you truly believe in, and what do you have? What do you have? What do you have? What reason do you have to survive? What reason do you have to go on? We did nothing wrong. We made no mistakes in our observations. We made no mistakes.
In a world where corruption, greed, and political maneuvering often win out over the virtues of the human spirit, we believed, perhaps naively, that an exception might exist in the experimental sciences. The history of science is littered with individual incidents of fraud, patent stealing, and flagrant misrepresentation, but here we found a contemporary conspiracy that overshadows most of what we've discovered in the phenomenon archives.